watching the mystical green beanie.
Hey, what's going on, dudes and dudettes? I am the mystical green beanie. So, DC Comics recently cut ties with Diamond Distributors, and understandably, everyone who works within the realm of comics is freaking out right now. Why? Well, okay. The best way that I can describe this is like when Martin Scorsese told Hollywood that they could lick his Academy Award winning ass while he released The Irishman on Netflix. This is that big. You know, like, in the same way that Scorsese just last year set in motion the next inevitable stage of the film industry's evolution, DC Comics has just changed the game in a big bad way. Now, I am of two minds on this. The first being that I think DC has potentially raw dogged the hell out of small business owners and local comic shops nationwide. However, the second is that I think DC has potentially raw dogged the hell out of Diamond Distributors, who is the largest monopoly in the comics industry. And understandably, there are tons of people, mainly comic shop owners, who are upset with DC over this, because now that DC is pulling out of Diamond, the status quo has shifted quite unexpectedly in the midst of a global pandemic, which was already a shit show for not just small businesses like local comic shops, but big businesses like JCPenney, Saks Fifth Avenue, and Disney. But let's take a minute to unpack this, shall we? So, regardless of how this all turns out, this signals the death of the local comic shop as we know it. Now, does this mean that comic shops are going to die? Probably not, but they will not look the same moving forward, because DC has just upset the apple cart. Well, more accurately, they've kicked the cart over, and part of it is seriously busted and now needs to be modified heavily. So, for those of you who don't know, Diamond Distributors is more or less the sole distribution house for American comic books, manga, statues, and toys for small business local comic shops. And with Marvel and DC being the industry leaders, in fact, many people refer to them as the Big Two, having one half of the Big Two just peace out and tell Diamond that they're no longer going to be distributing their product is, well, it's pretty fucking crippling for Diamond as well as local comic shops, to say the least. Now, I know that I just referred to Diamond as a monopoly, but here's the thing, and many local comic shop owners can attest to this. Diamond does bend over backwards for the sake of local comic shops, and that's mainly because Diamond's founder, Steve Geppi, was a comic shop owner. So it goes without saying that he knows the struggle of being a small business owner and has lent a helping hand to comic shops nationwide, maybe even worldwide. So when I call Diamond a monopoly, I'm not saying it with any sense of bitter resentment or thinking of Steve Geppi in the same way that I do Jeff Bezos or someone like that. But Diamond is the only game in town because in the 90s, they crushed the competition. And now that they're the only game in town, by definition, they're a monopoly. That said, they're a monopoly that pretty much every local comic shop has relied on for the past 25 years. So, what does this all mean? Is DC Comics leaving Diamond a good thing or a bad thing? Well, this is one of those situations where only time will tell. The only thing that we know for certain is that comic shop owners are pissed. Like, if you go to the Facebook or Twitter accounts of local comic shop owners, they are spitting venom all over DC's name. And in all fairness, that anger's justified. You know, there was, and still is, a global pandemic. Many stores are still closed because of the lockdown put in place by local governments to combat COVID-19. So, having this news break just as many comic book stores were starting to get their bearings again is understandably infuriating. Because what this means for stores is that, at the very least, if they are to continue buying product from DC, specifically and most importantly their periodical comics, more widely referred to as floppies, they're going to have to set up new accounts with whoever DC is going to mark as their new distributor. And I'm pretty sure it's Penguin Random House, so I'll just say it's them for the sake of the video. Which means that they're not only going to have to work with a non-uniform inventory delivery system, which also means different fees and more than likely less deals, because DC's new distributor of their floppies probably won't be led by someone who sympathizes with local comic shop owners. There's also the added wrinkle of DC completely changing their new comic book release schedule, because comic books are typically released on Wednesdays. That is the date when new comic books across the board are being released. However, if you look at their solicitations, instead of having their books being released on Wednesdays, they're now being released on Tuesdays, meaning that stores willing to carry DC books will now have to deal with 2 different release dates. But again, we'll just have to wait and see how this all turns out. Plus, from what I've heard from people who work with Diamond distributors, so take this with a grain of salt because this is secondhand knowledge, but from what I've heard, DC was already renegotiating their contract deal with Diamond long before the country went on lockdown. So if that's the case, then this is a situation that's been brewing for a while. It just really sucks that DC chose now, of all times, to act. Just, the timing is very, very bad. That said, that does beg the question, would there ever have been a good time to upset the apple cart like this? And that kind of segues me into my next big question. Is this a good thing? For comic book stores as they are currently, let me repeat, as they are currently, obviously not. But in the long run, for the industry as a whole,
Yeah, boy.
why? Well, okay, let's be honest here. The current model that the comic book industry has been working off of is the same model that they've been using for the past 100 years. And recently, really, the past 2 decades or so, things haven't been going so great. The comic book industry has been in a steady freefall for several years, and over the years, we've watched as Marvel and DC, as the industry leaders, feverishly attempted to bring in new readers by constantly relaunching and rebooting and throwing these massive events all in vain. Because while there might have been a sales boost in the short term, there are no long-lasting positive effects. So DC went with their final option. They stopped playing the same old game with the expectations of yielding new results. Because from the looks of it, I think DC is going to inch further and further away from the periodical comic format and move more in the direction of self-contained graphic novels and miniseries. Especially now that they're exclusively paired with Penguin Random House Publishing, who, from my understanding, distributes their graphic novels internationally. Because when you really take a look at what their big sellers are, it's not their monthly comics. It's Watchmen. It's Killing Joke. It's All-Star Superman. It's Batman White Knight. It's Mr. Miracle by Tom King and Mitch Gerads. It's Sandman. It's Hellblazer. It's Swamp Thing by Alan Moore. It's Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol. It's their original graphic novels from the Earth 1 line. It's DC superhero girls. And I think that's what DC is going to prioritize in the future. The very near future. In fact, I can very well see DC's print media being limited to just graphic novels and trade paperback collections. Meanwhile, their monthly periodical comics are scaled back drastically to 10 to 12 books that you can read digitally that will be collected in a graphic novel format upon the completion of each arc. And the reason I say that's the future, and the reason I support it, is because when I go to my local comic shop, not just looking at DC, but looking at comics as a whole, generally speaking, the floppies don't sell. Or at the very least, not nearly as well as trade paperbacks and graphic novels. In fact, and this very well could be limited to my local comic shop experience, what if I told you that the comic book industry was pulling in new readers, but they were more interested in dropping $10, $16, $25 on a graphic novel as opposed to $3.99 for a floppy periodical comic that they'd blow through in 30 minutes and have to wait 2 to 4 weeks to get the continuation of the story? What if I told you that even though books like Saga and Monstrous and Paper Girls were and are moderate successes when it comes to selling monthlies, their graphic novel sales bring in more money than a 5-year-old at a Hollywood sex slave auction? What if I told you that my local comic shop still has copies of Tom King and Mitch Gerads' Mr. Miracle piled on the racks, but will go through boxes upon boxes of reorders because they can't keep the graphic novel on the shelves? What if I told you that Marvel's recent reprints of their early issues of G. Willow Wilson's Miss Marvel and the early Miles Morales Ultimate Spider-Man comics in a YA graphic novel format sell better than the traditional trade paperback format in which they were collected in the first place? Look, I know that floppies are tradition, but the reality is they're just not selling anymore. And if DC is doing what I think they're doing, again, what I think they are doing, because I have no proof, this is just my theory, then we could very well be on the verge of a renaissance for the comic book industry. A rebirth, if you will, where comics are rightfully viewed as the profitable art form it is and always has been. Because when other publishers follow, because this isn't a matter of if, but when, we're going to be looking down the barrel of a whole new comic book industry in the next 3 to 5 years. Now, will DC's plan work? I have no idea. In fact, there's a strong possibility that they could fall flat on their ass and fail. Not because their ideas are bad necessarily, but because they've consistently shown that they lack the ability to follow through on any of their plans over the course of the past 15 years. But this is a situation where doing something is better than doing nothing. And now, given that they're under new leadership, hopefully they will follow through, and they will lead the industry in a bold new direction. Now, I've been seeing a lot of people spelling doom and gloom for local comic shops as a staple, as well as Diamond, but mainly local comic shops. Because even though DC isn't number one, and really they haven't been for the past 40 years, they are still a massive branch of the comic book industry tree. And now with that branch being cut off from Diamond, that's a huge hit for comic shops. But guys, it's far from the apocalypse. For the rest of the world, I don't know anymore, probably. But when you look at record stores, they're still here. Same as tabletop game shops and vintage toy stores. The traditional comic floppy will become a novelty, much like vinyl records. And I can guarantee that comic shops will always be there to sell them. That said, I think that the current model that comic shops are following is going to die sooner rather than later. And really, it all comes down to what I was saying earlier. The floppies just don't sell. And there's a variety of reasons for that, mind you. Chief among them being oversaturation. The American comic book industry is in a very unique place right now. One that I don't think it's ever been in. Because right now, its greatest strength is also its greatest weakness. Because when it comes to comics today, there truly is something for everyone. And while yes, that's a wonderful thing, it also crowds the market and floods the shelves. And when the shelves are just flooded with content, the consumer gets overwhelmed, and as a result, a lot of comics just fall by the wayside and go into the dollar boxes. And maybe the store owner can turn a profit by turning those comics into $1 or 50-cent back issues, but come on, I bet every store owner would much rather sell that product for cover price and make more money. But then that just loops back to my point about people preferring trades over monthly floppies. And I think that with trades selling better than floppies, the comic book stores that survive the next big change are going to be the ones that put more of an emphasis on trades rather than monthly periodical comics. So yeah, that's the current situation. I guess I'm pretty optimistic about all of this, but I don't want to make it sound like everything is just hunky-dory. It's not, and unfortunately, there will be a lot of comic book stores that are forced to close because of this. But I do think that this was a necessary step in what was the inevitable. The comics industry was always gearing up for a big change. It has for some time now. And with all change, it's ugly. In order to go from childhood into adulthood, you have to undergo puberty. And for those of you who can't remember, puberty sucks. And I think that this is the beginning of a very necessary change. And again, I do expect other publishers to follow DC on this. Namely Dark Horse, maybe IDW? But yeah, a lot of stores just aren't going to survive this. Diamond will be fine, for now. Especially if Marvel and Image continue to do business with them. But yeah, again, this is just a really shitty situation. The timing of this business decision was just awful. But I do think that this was something that needed to happen. Part of me is actually really surprised that DC took the initiative and did this. I always knew it was going to be one of the big two, but I always thought it was going to be Marvel who shot first. But guess I was wrong. Anyways, that's the video. Those are my thoughts, but what about you? What are your thoughts regarding all this? Let me know down below in the comment section. Also, if you like this video, hit the like button, share, support the channel, and if you want to see more content like this, all you have to do is subscribe. I'm the Mystical Green Beanie. Thanks for watching, and as always, until next time, adios, nachos, adios.
Show me what you got. This is over.